Someone asked a really great question about the difference between inflammatory process versus pain. And the person says, it seems like they're treated as two different things, but I also hear them used interchangeably. Then how does the mind and body handle each? And I really like this question because I did my dissertation on inflammation, and I can actually convey that information to you. It's been absolutely of no use for the past 10 years, but now, thanks to this question, there's a reason why I spent 5 years of my life focusing on something many, many years ago. So there's a little bit of pleasure in me. It's worth it. And I'm going to go into a little bit of nerdy detail as well, which also is one of the reasons why I'm feeling a little excited right now, because the nerdy detail is the best. And the conclusion of the nerdy detail is all of this doesn't matter for mind and body, which is yet another level of, it's just multiple levels of interesting stuff here. Let's see. Okay. So I will share. So the question is, what's the difference between inflammation and pain? And why are they used interchangeably? And how do they have different implications for the mind and body perspective? So acute pain is one of the 5 symptoms of inflammation. So if you look here, we have redness, heat, swelling, loss of function, and pain. This is one of the reasons why whenever you look in the literature, this is called inflammatory pain. There are lots of adjectives that are put in front of pain to qualify what kind of pain it is. Whenever people are talking about pain that specifically comes from inflammation, because there's no chronic processes present, that's inflammatory pain. And it's technically different from nociceptive pain, because nociceptive pain is just, it is the pain that is experienced and attributed to non-inflammatory processes whenever your body is encountering some sort of acute noxious stimulus. And acute inflammation can be caused by a lot of things. It can be caused by tissue damage. It can even be caused by scratching your skin, radiation, pathogen exposure. So you can also get inflammation from the threat of potential inflammation, for example. There are inflammatory processes that are triggered even whenever there's the presence of a bacteria or of yeast. So there doesn't have to be actual damage there. And let's see. One of the other ways that inflammation is characterized is through something called the inflammatory soup. So this is the end, this is a cartoon of the end of a nociceptor. That is a nerve ending that specifically takes in information that is about things in the environment that could harm you. And you don't need to know what all of this means. All of this means that there are lots of chemicals and proteins and molecules that flood the surface of nerve endings whenever there's inflammation. And they call it the inflammatory soup because it's just all mixed together. One of the interesting things that I've always found interesting about inflammation is how much redundancy there is in the body. If you were to knock one of these things out, there are other things that would do the same exact thing. So for example, if you're looking at mast cell activation, if you're to take antihistamine and knock out the histamine, you'd still have bradykinin. And well, this isn't an exhaustive list even because this is 2009, but you'd still have other molecules that take the place to activate mast cells. If you have some sort of inflammatory response from a bacterial infection or even just an autoimmune infection or an autoimmune condition, and you knock out TNF alpha, for example, you still have other things that will activate macrophages. And this is kind of a beautiful thing about the immune system, this redundancy, because if because the immune system is so critically important, if you take out any of these things, there are other things that will step in and take its role over. And this is one of the reasons why pharma companies have been so unsuccessful in targeting inflammatory pain, because they can create a drug that knocks out one of these things. But whenever you knock out one of these things, there are other molecules and proteins to take over that role. This is why I think the last novel drug, really novel drug created specifically for pain in the past 30 years was a failure once it got to clinical trials. So pain relief is one of the banes of the existence of pharma companies, because they can't totally get rid of it, even at the end of the nociceptor. One of the other weird things is that there are people who spend their whole lives studying just a couple of these chemicals. So there's lots of potentially excessive energy being put into this. But the idea is that if you were to create a recipe, I have this sort of cute, known as inflammatory soup recipe, what you would have, what is needed to create inflammation? You have the soup ingredients. So you have all these little chemicals bathing the end of the nerve ending. You have the detection of these ingredients by the receptors in the channels of that nerve. So you can't just have the stuff, it has to be detected as well. And then, but because they're detected, that generates action potentials or nerve firings along the actual nerve that carry that signal to the spinal cord. So you need the ingredients, you need the detection of the ingredients, and you need the neuron to carry that information to the spinal cord, which then passes on to the brain to say, hey, we have a signal here that's potentially nauseous and dangerous. And all of these ingredients, what they do is they make nociceptors, or these sensory nerve endings, more excitable. This is only for super nerds. What does excitable mean? There are 5 different, so this is, like I said, for super nerds. Most people do not need to know this much information, but okay, good. We have a super nerd online. Excellent. So then Tony, you will appreciate that very few pain scientists know all of this here, because and doctors definitely don't know all of this stuff, but this is gleaned from all of the literature looking at all the different ways that inflammation can change how a neuron sends information. What it does: first, it reduces the threshold for how much energy is needed to trigger a nociceptor. What that does is that can result in allodynia, meaning that the same amount of information triggers more of a response. Therefore, you get pain to normal, innocuous levels of stimulation. It also increases the rate of nociceptor activity. And it does this in a number of really interesting ways, but let's just keep it at that. Then also increases the rate of nociceptor activation with repeated stimulation. This is specifically a concept called wind up. So for example, when you are doing a task repetitively and the pain increases with each repetition, that is a great model for wind up. So you'll notice if you have inflammation in a limb and you're doing repetitive activity, and the pain gets worse and worse and worse with each movement, or it could be like with each exposure to more heat or more pressure, that's wind up. That's a specific property of inflammation. It also triggers random activation of nociceptors, which is the least understood of all of these things. It's called ectopic firing. And it just means that nothing is touching a nerve. It just starts to fire out of nowhere. And so this also has similarities with some types of neuropathic pain and neuropathic symptoms, where you're just sitting and all of a sudden there's a nociceptor that just fires, or there's a sensation that just starts. And what that means is that what it could mean is that I'm not sure I need to get into this detail right now, but the threshold of what it takes for that nociceptor to fire has been lowered so much that just background static can trigger the firing, just natural biological static. The final thing is silent nociceptors are activated, which is a very special class of nociceptors that are activated only in cases of inflammation. And in all other cases, you could press on these, you could try to trigger them and they wouldn't respond to noxious stimulation, and all of a sudden they do now. So in a sense, you increase in all of these things, what they're doing is they're increasing the nerve's ability to transmit information about some noxious stimulus that's happening, and it stimulates the strength, it makes that signal stronger, it makes it last longer, and it recruits other things that normally aren't painful or normally aren't, triggering these signals, and it sort of recruits them all. So the output of that is a few things. Inflammation tweaks the sensitivity of the nervous system to potentially harmful input, and it does it by optimizing how responsive these receptors are, how efficient the pathways are. It quiets down things that would normally inhibit the strength of those pathways or those circuits, and it strengthens how efficient those circuits are. And all of this is then input that the brain takes in as information about the environment. Now, what's interesting about this is this 5, this is all input. The brain can decide what to do with this information. If this sort of the strength of this overall signal is strong enough, the brain will consider it important enough to pay attention to, and that's whenever you perceive pain. However, there is a low level of inflammation in everyone's bodies. So to say that inflammation causes pain is not an accurate statement, because there are low levels of inflammation going on all the time. And inflammation is, for instance, it's part of how the body naturally cleans up wounds, how it naturally cleans up cells that shouldn't be there, how it detoxes, how it cleanses itself. So there's always a low level of inflammation going on that doesn't make it into conscious perception and isn't experienced as pain. And this is why they're considered separate. However, if you're looking at a nervous system, for example, that has a big load of stress, for example, in the background, stress itself amps up a lot of these systems that I've been talking about here, makes that signal stronger, and therefore more likely for the brain to pay attention to it and to sort of consciously create the pain perception. So this is why, even for people who have TMS and sort of, your pain is primarily mind-body pain. It's generated from the nervous system and the brain, and even then, things like diet, activity level, all of these things are still important in understanding how to modulate this incoming inflammatory signal, whether it makes it to conscious awareness or not. So this is why, for example, working on diet, an anti-inflammatory diet, or just taking more turmeric regularly, because studies show that turmeric is as effective as naproxen and doesn't have the harms associated with it. For example, turmeric with black pepper, which increases bioavailability. But even steps like having a more anti-inflammatory diet could potentially reduce that level of pain by reducing the input signal here. One of the interesting things about modern humans, given our diet and given our activity levels, is that I think that inflammation, higher levels of inflammation are probably quite normal, meaning most people have it. Normal in this case doesn't mean good, because what that means is that I think many humans would benefit from taking some anti-inflammatory measures. So especially if you're someone who has a lot of symptoms that that are unpredictable and you don't really know where they're coming from, one of the easy ways to rule out whether inflammation is impacting that is to do a period of like maybe 3 months of an anti-inflammatory diet where, for instance, maybe you use turmeric, or you just, reduce the amount of sugar. You look at, all the things in your diet that may be causing inflammation or excess inflammation, and just minimizing that and seeing whether your symptoms and pain change. It's like removing a layer of static away from the pain experience. And once you do that, then you see what's beneath. And what I've found, at least from some of the patients that I've worked with, is that can, I call it a layer of static, but it's sometimes it reduces the amount of variability in pain symptoms, but also I don't know how to explain this, but the underlying symptoms, the main pain drivers may become a little more clear after removing the layer of inflammation, sort of the information. And whenever I say the layer of inflammation, I'm thinking about it like a regression analysis, where you have like a certain amount that's of pain that could be influenced by inflammation, a certain amount that could be influenced by muscles, couldn't be influenced by stress, could be influenced by perceptions, etc. So it's like you're peeling away pieces of an onion. And for some people, part of that onion may be inflammatory pain. It doesn't mean that pain is no longer mind body. It just means that there's additional signals from the body that are being incorporated into the pain experience. And one of this also indirectly gets at a question that someone put in about the role of diet on chronic pain. In terms of what you're putting into your body and its inflammatory capacity, that is something I think that's worthwhile looking at. And that's one of the reasons why there are anecdotal evidence, anecdotal reports of people changing their diet to unprocessed foods, whole foods, and experiencing improvement in their pain. I think in cases where that happens, you're removing some of this inflammatory background. And then you're able to see more accurately, what do you have left? What is left then? There was one other point I wanted to make about this. Do I have something else? Yeah. And what I just discussed is at point 4, degree of harm caused by inflammation can reflect diet in general health. If you want to understand a bit more about the impact of stress and immune function on pain and inflammation, there's an old but wonderful book by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And he is just a beautiful science writer who really clearly talks about how stress translates into inflammation and how that can impact many different systems in the body. In a way, it's a more modern interpretation of Hans Sale's allostatic load theory. So this isn't a new idea. It has it's had multiple lives and has been discussed by multiple people. But I also want to reinforce that inflammation is good. It will always be there. You can't get rid of it, nor do you want to, because it helps repair things. But the time course of inflammation is usually hours, max weeks. So one of the other things is if you have pain that's lasted longer than weeks, it cannot be just due to inflammation, because the life cycle of an inflammatory response is shorter than that. That does not mean that there couldn't be continually triggered inflammatory responses, and you're seeing the impact of all of those together. There are also individual differences that can come into play. For instance, if you have chronic stress, which who doesn't right now? If you have chronic stress, it is worth it just to consider that, you know, having an anti-inflammatory diet may be beneficial if you haven't already explored this. And then there are certain things that are interesting. If there are any redheads, female redheads who watch this, you are special in many ways. But for instance, you have different inflammatory mechanisms that'll cause you to experience pain a little bit differently. Your pain threshold will be lower, meaning you'll feel pain before other people do, but you'll be able to tolerate pain to a greater extent. So a great example of this was a very dear friend of mine who in graduate school came to do testing for me the morning after being in the ER throwing up. She also did testing after breaking her collarbone the day before. Redhead women are fantastically interesting. And the person I did my graduate studies with produced the research showing that it's specifically how their bodies processed opioids. It's responsible for this difference. So there are lots of things that come into play whenever we're talking about inflammation. So that's a very, very long-winded, super detailed exploration of inflammation. And with all of that said, if you explore an anti-inflammatory diet and it doesn't do much, everything I just said doesn't matter. And just focus on the mind-body